Good evening. On behalf of the Castroville Conservation Society, I welcome you to our journey forward. I'm Martha Ortiz, the current president of the CCS. I hope that you've all had a chance to learn more about us from our brochure. But did you know that we funded the renovation of the windows on City Hall? And that we have funds set aside for the Houston Square improvement? And we're always interested in new ideas brought forward for new projects and endeavors. We have one meeting a year, and membership is open to all who are interested in our mission to keep Castroville historic. And now, Mayor Schroeder.
If I can just kind of back up with what Martha said, the great thing about the Castroville Conservation Society is that they are so active and so crucial in actually doing things. They're not sitting back and just kind of like this. They're actually out there with hands, setting up tables. I apologize for the first couple of them. Laura nearly knocked her leg off doing some of the breakdown with the tables. So they are very active in the community, and they care about Castroville. If you care about Castroville too, I would really encourage you to be a part of that. So I am Darren Schroeder. I am the mayor of Castroville. Happy to be I think my official title is Chief Serving Officer. I appreciate the fact that you put your trust in myself and in your city council to act on your behalf. And that's what this whole thing is all about. I know that most of you have been here for this. This has been great attendance. I was talking to Bryce, who's back in the back. If I can just give credit, this is all Bryce's fault, because he came to council, and so he's a city planner. He works for Rampage Law, and I still can't remember all the partners because there's a lot of them. They're really good. And he came to us and he challenged us as a city planner, saying, what ordinances do you want to put in place? How do you want, as the developers are asking for input on underground utilities or size of streets or amenities or parkland or open spaces, what do you want us to tell them? And we realized we don't know these things. We're not expert at this. Bryce is, and our speakers are. And so we went on this initial journey to figure out, what is it that people love about Castroville? What is it that we really care about? And that's not me, and that's not Councilman Carey or Councilman Dyer or Councilman King. It's not any individuals, but it's everybody. So it's really hard to figure out what everybody wants, and so we decided to come together. We're going to do this journey together. Some of you will care more about certain aspects than other ones will, but I thought that it would be good to give that perspective so that when we're making decisions, you can actually make those decisions with that. Nobody likes to be told what to do with their own stuff, but I think that we all have, no, I'm not going to steal that from you, Vince. So we don't want other people to encroach on us. And this whole journey has been, how do we grow as Castroville? How do we lock arms as a community? And this, we have history with this. 178 years just passed last Saturday. That was a really nice program, thank you. And it's about community coming together and the things that we can do together. So I want to introduce one more thing, and then I am going to be quiet because, again, I'm not the interesting one here. So to follow this up, had an epiphany over the weekend. We really need to add one more session to this. I hope you don't mind. We're going to do, so we have one more session next week. On Wednesday will be the final speaker session. The session after that, I've got to work that out with council and figure out what works for them. I want to get everybody back together without, we appreciate the insight that we're gaining from these people. They're giving us a really good picture of what we have and what's special about who we are. And we want to come back and give real, honest feedback. I know that sometimes you might not want to give honest feedback with somebody that you just really enjoyed and say, I think that's dumb. But you can tell me that I'm dumb. So we want to have this, we're going to have one more, we're going to figure out the date, we're going to get that out to you. Make sure if you have not given your email address that you do that, or get in touch with your council person or look out on social media and we'll announce that. So our final version is going to be all of us sitting down, hashing through this. We'll come to you with at least a brief implementation plan. Bryce will be he'll be moderating that, and he'll walk us through what the implementation plan could be, and let you challenge that as well. So that'll be our last one. I want to introduce Vince Michael. So Vince's advice when he came here was to leave the jacket at home. My advice from my wife that I listened to was put the jacket on. So different advice, same result. Vince Michael, the Executive Director of San Antonio Conservation Society, thank you so much for coming down. Please.
Thank you, Darren. Am I unmuted? I am. Can you hear me? Okay. Wow. So the joke he left for me, and it's not a joke, it's actually something I tell my students. I taught historic preservation for many years. I'm actually teaching again by Zoom tomorrow night, was that there are two things that are always true in America. One is no one wants to be told what to do with their property, and the other truth is that everyone wants to tell their neighbor what to do with their property. And both those things are always true at the same time. I want to give you first a little perspective on how I view historic preservation before I get into the discussion of community character and historic districts. A lot of people think that preservation is a bunch of rules, Secretary of Interior standards that you have to follow. I don't think it's a bunch of rules. I think it's actually a process. And you right now are in the middle of that process. It's a process whereby a community determines what elements of its past it wants in its future. And that process is actually enshrined in the National Historic Preservation Act as 4 steps. Identify what you have, evaluate how important it is, register it if you want to, and then how do you actually treat that? What is the actual physical things you do? So you can think of that as hunt them, catch them, cook them, and eat them, right? Identify, evaluate, register, and treat. So the first step is identifying what do we think is important. And these are going to be images from all over the world to a certain degree. Then evaluate, how does it relate to the other things around it? How important is it? Then, if you want to make it a Texas landmark or some sort of local landmark or National Register landmark, that would be another step. And then the final step is, how do you actually treat it? Does that mean you just save the facade, like this example here? Or does it mean you get experts to restore every inch of a detailed mural that's in China? What do you do when you treat the property? What does that mean? Do you have to save the outside, the inside? What does it mean? And so for me, preservation is the way a community preserves its character. And it has to be a community process. The mistake that people make, and the reason they think it's a bunch of regulations, is that a bunch of egghead PhDs like me come around and say, these are the rules, when actually, if the community is involved in the process, the final treatment, when you're eating it, has had the community involved all the way along. Standards guidelines are specific to a place, but this process works anywhere. That's the process going on in a little village in Yunnan province in China. So how do we define community character? And I'm sure you've covered some of this and probably will next week as well, but there are certain things to think about. We did a series of workshops before the pandemic in San Antonio with neighborhood groups. And in many cases, in neighborhood groups, the developer would come in and say, oh, I'm going to build this. And they're like, oh, it's too big, it's too high. And our first step was, let's get a little more nuanced. So we're not just saying no, we're saying no in a way that we understand the problem. Is it a problem of scale? Perhaps it's a problem of density, or the massing, or the setbacks. It's too close to the street, too far from the street. The rhythm, how do the buildings look? And then finally, type and style. And again, most people think it starts with type and style. It doesn't. That's the least important thing. So looking at those, scale. Here's an obvious case, a nice Victorian building with a giant high-rise behind it, which is out of scale. But in another place, a 3-story building could be out of scale. Then there's the question of density, and my friend and architect Jim Bailey always uses this example in the King William Historic District in San Antonio, which is the first historic district in Texas. There are these wonderful old 1920s apartment buildings. They're fully furnished apartments you can rent. Their density is 126 units per acre, but they fit right in because of the way they're designed and their size. And then there's the question of massing. So you have a bunch of houses on a street here. This is up in Oak Park, Illinois. Looks like 2 nice houses. That's actually 7 units. But most of the units are in the back where you can't see them. Or do you do the 7 units like that? We get a lot of these in the areas in San Antonio that are outside of historic districts because they're cheap and easy to replicate. Then there's the question of setbacks. This is a new development, but it has a setback that mimics the historic street, whereas this one's right up to the street and has a very different feel as you walk down the street. Then you have the question of rhythm, type, and style. So how does the neighborhood, how does the village get put together? How do you feel when you walk down the street? And the rhythm of the buildings can be things like roof shapes. It can be things like the arrangement of windows and doors. Architectural historians, I'm sure Catherine talked about solids and voids. We like what we see when there's a variation of solids and voids. If something's a black wall, it makes us a little more depressed. So in rhythm, type, and style become very important at the end after you've dealt with the questions of scale, massing, density, and setbacks. Now, I'm mostly going to be focusing on historic districts, but coming out of this approach for community character, you can look at several possibilities. You can look at historic districts, and I'm going to give you a little history of historic districts. You can look at conservation districts, which are sort of historic districts light. They don't really prevent demolition or alteration, but they encourage people to maintain character. There are zoning. In fact, all of these are forms of zoning. And then you can have plans and guidelines. And I actually, the mayor sent me the design guidelines, which are actually quite good. These are really good. I've looked through the book, and nice, clear illustrations that show you the idea of the kind of design you'd like to have for new infill or additions to historic buildings. I also wanted to mention in San Antonio and some other places, one of these is from the San Antonio Riverwalk and the other is from Fredericksburg, that there are often sign regulations as well as to how much of a facade can be covered by a sign. And you know, if you are on an interstate and there's a gas station, those signs are gigantic, and you don't want those in the center of town. Okay, so what do historic districts regulate? First, I'm going to talk a little bit about historic districts, and then I'm going to give you the history to understand where they came from. They mostly are concerned with exteriors of buildings from the public right-of-way. They're not usually concerned about interiors at all, and things on the back are otherwise invisible. So this is a sort of, maybe it's a bad example. This is a historic house in Oak Park, Illinois, and they had to preserve that from the public right-of-way. And because of the nature of the block, you can see on the back they built 4 more of them. And you might agree or disagree with that, but the point is it did fit into those guidelines. Why do people want historic districts? So I'm going to delve into economics for a second. Real estate is one of the only assets whose value is entirely externalized. A real estate developer or a realtor will tell you it's location, location, location. But economically, that means that the value of my house is determined by the houses around me. If I know the houses around me will still be there, I know the value of my house will still be there. I can give you an extreme example of this. Almost 30 years ago, this is a group of apartments that were built by Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago in 1894. And 30 years ago, with an organization I bought 2 of them for $1 each, $1 each, $2. I paid $40,000 too much because those buildings had a negative value based on what was around them, even though they were by Frank Lloyd Wright. That doesn't matter. So the point is that property doesn't have intrinsic value. It has a value based on what's around it. That's what gives it its value. So basically, historic districts come from people rehabbing buildings and trying to preserve their value. People start rehabbing and want to protect their investment. Way back in the 1890s, we get the first forms of zoning in California, which are use zoning to keep industrial uses away from things like schools and churches and houses. In 1916, New York passes the first modern zoning law that not only regulates use, but also density, because they were getting all these giant skyscrapers that choked off light and air to the street. In the next 10 years, 591 communities across the United States, covering the properties of 30 million people, adopted some form of zoning. And those mostly weren't Manhattans, because there's only one Manhattan. Those were mostly residential suburbs. The economists would tell you that the reason was that zoning was a response to the radical uncertainty created by the truck and the automobile. Because in a 19th century town, you knew which was the right side of the tracks. If the tracks aren't fixed anymore, because you've got trucks and cars, how do you know what the right side of the tracks are? You create zones. So, as soon as they think of zoning, and even before the Supreme Court declares zoning is okay, Charleston and New Orleans start looking at historic zoning. Because if I can say, okay, here's a zone where there's only residential, and here's a zone where there's commercial or industrial, I can also say, here's a zone where there's only old buildings. And Charleston and New Orleans both looked at that before the Supreme Court found zoning legal. Charleston was threatened by a variety of things. Automobile tourists, because the automobile is new, remember that radical uncertainty, started coming down and visiting Charleston. It was great, it was beautiful, it was historic. And they're like, this is lovely. And so in Charleston, they're like, well, let's tear down these buildings so we can build the gas stations to service all these cars coming down. And then the tourists were like, oh, I love your interiors. I'm going to buy those and take them up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And so these local preservation groups are like, we've got to stop this. And they said, okay, we'll buy the historic house, the Manigault House. They had to buy it 3 times in 10 years. And they suddenly realized buying the house isn't going to save the town. So they created the first historic district in the United States in 1931 in Charleston. It was called the Olden Historic District. The ordinance did not control interiors. It didn't even prevent demolition. But it was the first true historic district motivated by community desires. Now, about the same time in the 30s, you had colonial Williamsburg, which John D. Rockefeller restored, brought back buildings that weren't there, tore down buildings that were 100 and some years old because they didn't fit into the period. This had huge influence. This was the nation's premier tourist attraction in the 1940s and 50s. And people built colonial revival stuff everywhere across the country. And a lot of other places said, let's do a historic museum village. But I would argue that colonial Williamsburg is not really the kind of historic district we're looking at. Charleston and New Orleans are better examples. And New Orleans is interesting because it was different. It wasn't big, beautiful, fancy houses. A lot of it was more urban. A lot of it was sort of regular buildings. And they came across with the concept of the tout ensemble, the whole thing. The whole thing was more valuable than the sum of the parts. And the Vieux Carré, the old French Quarter, became a historic district in 1937. They had to do a state constitutional amendment to do this. But other places started copying it. Natchez, Mississippi. San Antonio was already doing La Villita in 1939. Monterey, California creates a zoning ordinance in 1940 for that old Spanish town. La Villita in San Antonio was originally just a quarter of the size it is today, and it was a Works Progress Administration Depression-era work project with the National Youth Administration, where famously Mayor Maury Maverick said he contrasted it with colonial Williamsburg. He said, Villita shall not be a dead museum for mincing scholars. He even included an illustration of a mincing scholar in the ordinance so you could see what they looked like, and he contrasted them with the young jitterbuggers. He said he wanted to be a living place, so they partnered with the National Youth Administration and taught trade. So you weren't just preserving houses, but you were also preserving textile making and carpentry and ceramics and things like that. This is, by the way, where the Conservation Society, to continue the tradition of the jitterbuggers and not the mincing scholar, hosts its annual Night in Old San Antonio event. So in the 1940s, you have a lot of other museum villages and historic places: Sturbridge Village, Municipal Art Society, Alexandria, Williamsburg. King William starts seeing people in San Antonio start restoring there in the 1940s. Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Santa Barbara, and museum villages in Mystic, Plymouth, and Sherburne up in New England. I would argue the first modern historic district was actually Georgetown. Georgetown, we now know, is a part of D.C. Originally, it was a separate town. It was incorporated into the District of Columbia in 1871. And it had been in economic decline. And in the 1930s, people started rehabbing. And then, of course, it was the 1940s, and people were wanting to build highways and big apartment buildings. And so the Citizens Action got involved, and all these groups came together. And they literally, I'm using the word correctly, had to get an act of Congress to create the historic district, because it was in D.C. They couldn't just say, we want a historic district. They had to have an act of Congress. Shortly after that, Annapolis, Maryland, New Orleans survived its fifth court challenge in 1953. The same year that historic districts were created in Santa Fe and St. Augustine, and the following year in Tombstone, Arizona. Which I always think is kind of unfair. Tombstone had one shootout. We probably had a lot more shootouts here, right? 1954 is also the year of a famous Supreme Court decision, not Brown versus Board of Education, but Berman versus Parker, which is codified something they called the right of cities to be beautiful. And this is counterintuitive, but this decision led to two things that are opposite. So just like our two things about people, don't want to be told what to do, want to tell the neighbor what to do, this decision led to both urban renewal, where you wipe everything out, and historic preservation, where you create historic districts. They're both the right of a city to be beautiful. It's just a different idea of what beautiful is. 1954, you have the Housing Act. And by 1955, the Massachusetts legislature creates Beacon Hill Historic District in Boston and Nantucket Historic District on Nantucket Island. And the significant thing about that is it's created by the legislature. And that's about to change. First of all, a little bit about Beacon Hill. One of the things I found interesting in studying this history is that the places that preserved themselves had been doing it for a long time. It wasn't like all of a sudden, oh, we need to do this. No, there was a guy named John Codman Sr. who organized this neighborhood group in the 1920s to get zoning. Remember, zoning came along in the 20s. They demolished 700 houses in the West End near Beacon Hill in the 1950s. And his son works to secure historic zoning and then promotes it with this book called Controlling Community Character with Historic Districts, or something like that. So the district was not motivated by tourism. People still go there, but unlike New Orleans and Charleston, or Tombstone, or St. Augustine, the idea wasn't tourism, but the idea is the community just wanted to keep what it had. And the interesting thing is that the following year, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts created enabling legislation. So all of a sudden now you didn't have to go like New Orleans did, or like Georgetown did to Congress, and go to your state legislature to get your district. You could get the city to create it. And Salem, Massachusetts was the first to do that. Philadelphia had the first citywide landmarks ordinance in 1956. Chicago sort of did one in 1957, along with doubling the density in the city. New York did a similar one. They thought it was going to be 16 million people by 1980. And then Brooklyn Heights in New York looks for historic zoning. You also had some combinations of urban renewal and preservation. The hills, you had Hyde Park Kenwood in Chicago, College Hill in Providence, Society Hill in Philadelphia. Here's the thing I'd like you to remember. Urban renewal and historic preservation had the same motivations, but advocated different formal solutions. The former, urban renewal, appealed to the architectural professionals. Let's make everything new and perfect and beautiful. And the latter appealed more to the community activists. So what's happening down here? Well, in 1968, San Antonio is the first place to have a World's Fair that didn't demolish everything. It was an urban renewal project. It was a 92-acre urban renewal site. But they saved 24 historic buildings. They tore down a lot more than that, but they did save them, and they're all still there. The other solution during urban renewal was to create a museum village. And that was very appealing to architects and developers because it's, okay, we've got some important historic buildings here, and we've got some here. Why don't we just push them all over here so we can just do whatever we want over here? It was a convenient alternative to true preservation. So a couple quick examples I'm going to give you, and I hope this doesn't go too long for you. I wrote my dissertation on this, so I am shortening it, don't worry. Brooklyn Heights is this neighborhood facing Manhattan. It wanted to create a historic district. Like Georgetown, they had fought expressways. Robert Moses wanted to build an expressway right through the center of town. They pushed it out to the edge, the Esplanade. And they were fighting these high-rises, and they wanted to create a historic district like Beacon Hill had done. And the city, other groups in the city said, well, wait till we get an ordinance for the whole city. So they did. And they worked with Brooklyn Heights and Greenwich Village and said, let's try to create grassroots support for a landmarks ordinance. Historic districts were a late addition to the landmarks law. Harman Goldstone, who was chair of the Landmarks Commission in 1965 when it was passed, said, I think over the next 20 years you'll see maybe 3 or 4 more historic districts besides these 2. He underestimated that by a lot. But people at that time thought of preservation as just monuments. They're sort of preserved in amber, not places that are alive. The preservation gave communities qualitative control over the built environment, but unfortunately it didn't give them quantitative control. And so a year after getting their historic district, they passed limited height zoning, so they wouldn't have huge scale problems of new buildings going up. Meanwhile, Greenwich Village was fighting another expressway through the south of Manhattan Island, high-rises, urban renewal. And Jane Jacobs, of course, was famously there and talked about districts really as sort of almost political entities. Effective districts operate as things in their own right, and most particularly must their citizens who are in agreement with each other on controversial questions act together at district scale or they get nowhere. And they were successful. I mean, Greenwich Village was a funny place because it was a little like New Orleans. It wasn't actually high-style architecture. It had been a very bohemian place. In the 1930s, you could take a Gray Line bus tour of Greenwich Thrillage, you know, and see the people dressed as pirates and eating spaghetti and doing other exotic things. And so it was kind of this artistic place. But they were very careful to get residential zoning in the first zoning ordinance in 1916. And then they fought, just like Brooklyn Heights, urban renewal. Robert Moses said, let's turn Washington Square into a traffic circle. It was called the bath mat plan because it looked like a bath mat. They beat that down in the 30s. He came back in the 50s and said, let's make it a highway interchange. You know, there's the Washington Arch right in there, right? And they defeated that again. So they got their historic district finally. Oh, not finally. They had a little trouble because they sent down the experts. They sent down the architectural historians. The architectural historians looked and they saw all the cut-throughs on 7th and 8th Avenue with high-rises and other buildings. And they said, well, this isn't one district. This is 18 separate historic districts because you have this other stuff in between. And we can't have that. It's not architecturally pure. And it went back and forth. The community and the experts fought for 4 years, until 1969. Academic architectural standards versus the community impulse for control over their built environment. And the community won. They got what is still the largest historic district in New York. They got one district. I asked a guy who was working at the Landmarks Commission at the time, I said, why did that happen? And how did they get this district with all those spots in between that weren't significant? And he said, the district had a lot of garbage in it, And the idea of the big district was that the junk would come under control and eventually get better. Isn't that an interesting approach? San Antonio gets his first historic district with the 1967 enabling law, and the King William district, they had La Villita, private. King William was an area where people had been rehabbing for about 20 years. It, of course, was the famous German area in San Antonio. It became the first historic district in Texas. It had been rehabbed by young professionals, and the idea of the zoning was to protect it for the benefit and enjoyment of the public. The next historic districts came in the 1970s. Monte Vista, which tends to be large houses, but also includes a lot of smaller bungalows and so forth. And main and military plazas in the hemisphere all became historic at that time. I'm switching over to Chicago now, because Chicago had a real hard focus on architecture. That's where Frank Lloyd Wright is from. That's where Louis Sullivan was from. Mies van der Rohe went there. And so they were so focused on architecture, they couldn't get their heads around the idea of a historic district. And their first two historic districts were arguably single works of architecture. This place called Alta Vista Terrace, which was designed by one architect at one time, and Pullman, which was an industrial design, again, designed by one architect at one time. And they didn't believe in multiple different architects and styles and things like that. But they had a Greenwich Village, a place called Old Town. And it was their bohemia. It was like Greenwich Village. They had been home to artists and alternative lifestyles. They had been rehabbing buildings since the turn of the 20th century. And a lot of the buildings were sort of messed up. They weren't architecturally pure, but they were organized. They were organized as a community. And they actually organized to get urban renewal funds in 1954. And then the urban renewal started, and they started tearing stuff down, and everyone changed their mind all of a sudden in the late 60s and said, we don't really like all this tearing down. We want to save this, and it became one of the first historic districts. And it did the same thing as Frank Sanchez said about Greenwich Village. They did a big district, and the planning commissioner said the additions to the district consist of vacant land or improvements that do not necessarily enhance the historic character of the district. Although the commission has no legal power in such matters, it is hoped that by including these parcels, attention will be drawn to their unique location in relationship to the Old Town district. Thus, in an indirect way, the area's redevelopment might be influenced to proceed in a manner consistent with the prevailing qualities and character of the district, which is just a long way of saying eventually, over time, the junk will get better. And immediately, the neighborhoods right around it along the lakefront, where there's very high zoning, became historic districts too in the 1970s. And they created specific design guidelines for their specific district. Because again, going back to my first principle, you can't have one set of guidelines for everything. They have to be specific to the place, because each place is built a little differently. In Chicago, in the 1980s, they started rehabbing districts on the south side. They basically found the same phenomenon. You had young urban professional rehabbers on the south side rehabbing areas. They just happened to be African American. Calumet Giles Prairie District was a very significant one that happened in the 1980s adjacent to the black metropolis. By the 1980s, the question of gentrification had come up. And this is another one of those sort of odd parallels. There was a neighborhood called Wicker Park on the northwest side, which had been sort of a melting pot historically, mostly Victorian buildings. And the city was worried about gentrification, so they didn't want to make it a landmark. Meanwhile, a neighborhood just north of it called Bucktown saw every property value triple in 1 year in 1987, almost because it didn't have the regulation. And a lot of stuff got torn down there. Eventually, Wicker Park was designated, and it has gentrified, but it's taken 20 years. So, on the one hand, preservationists like to say that historic districts increase property values. Remember my economic principle. But they also don't want to be associated with displacement. So again, one of those challenging dilemmas. We're seeing a similar thing happening right here in San Antonio right now. They proposed a historic district on the west side called Buena Vista, which is on the near west side of San Antonio, basically from 10 west to Zarzamora. And there's been a lot of opposition to it. There were people putting up signs, vote no to the historic district. In fact, this happened during COVID, so they were like, no, the historic district is a virus like COVID, you know, it's bad, we don't want it. And at the same time, on the other side of town in Government Hill near Fort Sam Houston, you had a historic district there fighting the same issues as these people on the west side, but from opposite positions on historic districts. One was using their district to say, they're not enforcing enough, we've got to fight these developers. The other was saying, if they create the historic district, the developers will get us. Okay, so my final little history story is about a couple of inner city districts in Chicago and New York, and it has some parallels here, but I wanted to draw your attention to this. This was a series of townhomes, affordable townhomes that were built in 1987 in this neighborhood called North Kenwood on the south side of Chicago. Most of the neighborhood looked like this. And you can see their characters completely diametrically opposed. Those enter on the ground, they don't have a step up to where they enter, they have a different type of facade, a different type of roof line, everything about them is different. And what happened here was really a community effort, and it was an interesting one because the community wanted more preservation. They had surveyed the entire city and they had come up with this map. Oops. They had come up with this map and they had identified this little 1 block long historic district where the buildings all looked good. And then they identified other buildings in the neighborhood that were nice or historic and should be saved, but they were all separated by a lot of vacant land or other stuff. So they came up with a new idea. They created a multiple resource district, which designated that little central piece, but then the individual buildings, but not the land in between. Now in North Kenwood, they had a little more pushback on that. The neighborhood kept coming in saying they wanted more buildings included. They were tired of demolition. They were tired of not getting resources in their community. So they fought against the experts at the Landmarks Commission, who initially proposed a historic district of 171 properties with a small little 1 block area. Oops, hard to hit that arrow. Little 1 block area there. And eventually, over 2 years of fighting back and forth, they almost doubled the size of their historic district, including having people come in at the last minute to the city council saying, I would like my property included in this district. So the commission staff said, well, you can't have these properties in because they're not salvageable. Guess what? They're still there. They were salvaged. So they wanted to control new development and stop demolition. That was their motivation, and the historic district is what they did. And the new development that's gone in has been of better character. These are 2 old buildings. These are 3 new ones. They fit right in. So similar, my parallel to that was Hamilton Heights in Harlem. Hamilton Heights had been designated in New York in 1974. It was a relatively small district, and they excluded all apartment buildings, and they never would do anything north of 145th Street because that was a slum. So this was the district designated in 1974. You're going to watch this map. In the 1990s, they designated an apartment building because it was full of all these famous people in African American history who lived there, 409 Edgecombe and Sugar Hill. And so they designated. All of a sudden, the equation changed. The architectural historians were allowing apartment buildings to be designated. So they went back and filled in the spots that they had missed on their historic district. And then in the course of the next 2.5 years, that district moved north. They did an addition in 1999. They did another addition in 2000. They were doing another addition on September 9th, 2001 that didn't get completed until 2002. So all of a sudden you had a district that ran from 138th to 160th Street because the community wanted it. 4 separate additions created a continuous district from 141st to 160th. Similar things happened in San Antonio, oddly enough. King William expanded into what we called Baja King William, the other side of Alamo Street, in 1984. Dignowity Hill on the east side was designated the same year. The Mission Historic District, the largest in the city, 7 miles long along the missions, along the South San Antonio River and our World Heritage missions, was created, and it got its own individual design guidelines in 2018. Monticello Park was a historic district created in 1995, and just like Hamilton Heights, it had additions done in 1997, 2003, 2008, and 2010, because the surrounding people felt it was a good deal, and they wanted to get the same thing their neighbors had. Lavaca, another area designated in 2001 with other additions in the next 5 years. And this is one, Lavaca, by the way, it's next to King William, has a lot of modern infill in it. Almost Park Terrace was created in 2007, had additions in 2008 and 2009. These are stone-faced cottages from the 1930s. We also had conservation districts in San Antonio. We had a rush of creating them in the first decade of the 21st century. We just created our first one in 12 years. These don't have as much regulatory control, but they help push developers to doing sensitive infill. This is actually wonderful. This was a very heartwarming preservation story. The community came together to help the guy who owned this house save it. It was falling to bits, and they got the city council involved in everything, so that was saved. This one down here is one of those wonderful homeowners who I was getting a tour of the windows here before. He restored all his windows in this prairie-style house. We had a lot of Spanish colonial houses built in the 20s. Some of those became historic districts, like the Fulton District, which is near Fredericksburg Road. Keystone Park, also near Fredericksburg Road, done in more Tudor-style houses. The fake Fachwerkbau, of course, here we are in Castroville, you have real Fachwerkbau. River Road is an interesting historic district that we have because it's really defined by its boundaries. It's bounded by the river on one side, the park on the other, and the highway on the other. And it has a variety of styles, but it's an incredibly active community. And one of the things I found over many, many years, it's not so much the quality of the buildings, it's how well the community is organized that determines what's going to happen. Because some communities show up for a hearing, and other ones don't. King William shows up for a hearing, Lavaca doesn't. The Nathan Historic District, this was one of the newer ones. And I brought this quote from 1966. When they passed the National Historic Preservation Act, the first thing they did was a bunch of Congress people took a trip to Europe to see historic buildings there. And they took it by boat, by the way, in 66. They weren't flying jets yet. They took a boat. And they saw what they were doing, and they came back with the idea of preservation and the idea of historic districts. And Christopher Tunnard, they produced a beautiful book. It's like a coffee table book. How often does a piece of legislation get a coffee table book? And it was called With Heritage So Rich, and it had this wonderful quote about districts. The motive in obtaining the district may be purely aesthetic, or it may be to prevent a rundown part of town from getting worse. It may be to preserve the architecture of a specific period, or of all periods. It may even be monetary, as historic districts have proved to raise values within their own limits and in surrounding areas. And again, if you come back to that principle, where's the value of your house come from? From what's around you. If I wake up in the morning and I look out and I see all the houses on the block and I know they're going to be there in the future, I feel more confident of the preservation of the value of my house. Here's another, this one's only a block long. We'll see if it works. I think I actually have a little video so you can sort of think back to the ideas of rhythm and style and massing. These are a bunch of bungalows. This is not far from the River Road District, not far from Breckenridge Park. Let's see if this will work. I was hoping there was a video. Guess not. Sorry. But you can see the sort of bungalow roof lines. Now, Tobin Hill is another historic district. These are sort of near each other, and they're reacting to a lot of new development. 2019, we did this heat map showing where demolitions were happening. This is the Monte Vista Historic District, this is River Road, this is East French Place, this is Tobin Hill. And you can see right outside the historic district is where all the demolitions are. That's where things are going down, and still are. I've got to get an updated version of this map from the city because they have updated and it's even more dramatic today. So what happens outside of districts? Well, sometimes you get something that you could argue is sensitive and appropriate. More often you get these, and these are all adjacent to the Tobin Hill Historic District. This one went up, and they tore down 3 wonderful old houses to build this, and it was almost like shipping containers stacked on top of each other. And I like the way I cropped this, because it says limitless, and then there's CR, and you can sort of fill in whatever you want for the rest of that word. Interestingly, there's also attempts to create districts that don't gentrify. In Pilsen, the largest Mexican-American community in the Midwest in Chicago, they created a historic designation that included mural preservation and affordable requirements. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It got bogged down by politics. The Buena Vista district is that same example happening to us in San Antonio right now because there has been neighborhood opposition. Oh, there's the sign where it compares the historic district to stop the spread of the virus. Historic district is like COVID. So, what is the sort of conclusion of all this history? Communities often provide political support for historic districts. They need the egghead PhDs to provide justification to talk about the architecture and stuff like that. Professional surveys give tools to the community like they did way back in 1957 in Brooklyn Heights. But the community planning concerns about zoning, scale, redevelopment, property values, and amenities influence these districts. So Brooklyn Heights adopted limited height zoning after it's got its historic district that didn't do everything it wanted it to do. And again, going back to the economists, some call a historic district as a partial secession that gives greater community control over development as opposed to feeling like you're totally at the hands of outside forces. So those are the reasons why people create historic districts, what they do, and where they came from. Community activists changed preservation from an antiquarian concern about museum objects in the environment into a future-oriented planning tool. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. That was great. A huge topic. Can you give us any advice on what you glossed over, the issue of gentrification?
Right.
We need some advice.
Yeah, so it's, as I said, it's something that, I mean, to some extent you can't avoid that dilemma. You either want to keep or increase your property values or you don't. And so Pilsen in Chicago was an example. They created this affordability requirement. There are some interesting tools people are trying to use to avoid that gentrification problem. And gentrification isn't always displacement. One of the reasons the North Kenwood example worked, if you will, is it was sort of an area that had actually been depopulated. And most of the community supported it because there were people that had been there a long time, inherited the house over several generations. And so you sort of had a neighborhood that was made up of homeowners who had hung on to places as the value declined. So when the value went up, they were the direct beneficiaries, and there weren't as many transients. Displacement is usually something that initially happens to transients. Now, we are having the issue in San Antonio where you have, or anywhere else, where property values rise, and you have someone, especially people on fixed incomes, who the property tax bill becomes a big issue. So that's almost a separate way. And usually there are some techniques from land banks to senior property tax abatements and stuff like that to deal with that specific aspect of displacement. So there are 2 kinds of displacement, one of renters and the other of owners.
I think you touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to see if you could go deeper on the question of important properties, relevant properties, completely irrelevant properties.
Right.
As you think about a district that is large and encompasses a range of both historic and non-historic,
Right.
beautiful and not beautiful buildings.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about how communities have managed that process of designating which are which within that?
So that's a really good question. And the examples I gave, especially places like Old Town and Greenwich Village, they designated the big district. And the reason, they included stuff that they knew wasn't as significant as something else. So the idea is, again, you want to be specific. A process of identify, evaluate, register, and treat is universal, but your specific district has specific guidelines. So you could identify in your district sort of grade 1 buildings, grade 2 buildings, whatever, and you could say, for these buildings, we really want to keep the exterior the same. For these buildings that have lost integrity or are modern intrusion or something like that, you could do something different there. So that was their motivation in a lot of these big districts, was that it would influence the development of stuff that wasn't actually historic to be the way it was. So going back to our process of identify, evaluate, register, and treat, at the evaluation stage, you determine what are the key elements we want to see when we get to the last stage. Is it the roof line? Is it the material? Is it the windows, the porches, or stuff like that? Is it the setback? So if you come across a property that doesn't have that essential feature that you want in the future, that property is less significant than the one next to it that does have that essential feature. Does that make sense? Sorry? Yeah. Who determines that? So in my examples, it was a combination of people with some expertise in describing these things and the community. So I've worked in preservation projects in other parts of the world where the key aspect is finding out what the community wants to save. Maybe they don't want to save buildings. Maybe they want to save their mulberry bark paper factory. So how do we save the mulberry bark paper factory? You know, what is the economic challenge? What are the supply challenges? Things like that. So there are, you know, when they created the first historic district in Charleston, they had a board of architectural review. When they created the one in Georgetown, they had the architect of the Capitol on that. So in both those cases, you had what was arguably sort of an elite group of experts. Those have changed over time. So you go to the Historic and Design Review Commission in San Antonio right now, there are a couple architects on there. There are a couple developers on there, or people in real estate development. There are a couple people who are just maybe historians or citizens. So it's a mix. It depends. There isn't one rule for how to do it.
For Castroville, what do you see as the obstacles and solutions to those obstacles in the process of developing any historical districts or whatever?
Right. So, I mean, and I'm not an expert. I've been here a bunch of times, and I love it. I enjoy the historic buildings. I like the scale. To me, the reason I talked about rhythm and scale, there's a feel of houses and spaces between houses I get in the center of Castroville I don't get in other places. Maybe a little bit in parts of Fredericksburg, but so I think to me that's a key character. I understand you're getting a lot of big scale suburban style development on the outskirts, you know, where they just basically build 400 houses in one place. We get a lot of that too. So the question is, you know, what do you want to save? The question is, what does the community want to bring in the future? Do you want to keep that core as it is? Or do you want to keep that core with added density? You can do either. Do you want to control that stuff out on the edge where they're building 400 houses all in one place or not? Those are sort of the key decisions. I mean, every time I come through, I take pictures of the houses that have plaques on them and things like that, which is great. To me, it's like, you know, what do you want the community to feel like? The other thing you could think about is very specific guidelines for something like Highway 90. It could be really nice, you know? I mean, you come over here, it's like, I'm in a place. This is a special place. I see this place. You hire a whole bunch of experts, not just me. But no, but seriously, it is. It's yeah, it does. So flip that. That could be an opportunity. You've got this right here. How could that reflect the fact that this is right here? We were talking earlier in San Antonio how you drive up Broadway and you have no idea that there's a 343-acre Breckenridge Park over here because you don't see it from there. You could think of Highway 90 the same way. You've got this wonderful historic area here, but how would you know it when you're over there?
Just walking through the Castroville area, Just a general overview, do you see any specific areas that tend to fall more into one type of district that would be more suitable for historic designation or regional or something of that nature that would give us a block, a particular type of style versus one over on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I remember bringing my parents through here 6 years ago, a little more than 6 years ago, driving through, and it was actually kind of a rainy day. And there were nice areas on both sides of 90. So in my mind, I saw a big district at that time, but you may not see that.
Are there any situations in which you would recommend against a historic district or designation for a particular area or building?
Very clever question. That's a good one. There are some, and I have, on some cases, recommended against a district. So, for example, the multiple resource districts I talked about specifically excluded the vacant land in between. I could argue both sides of that equation. I could say, don't do that district because we don't want to control that vacant land, or do it that way because we want to control that vacant land. I think, yeah, you could find a place where you could say a district doesn't really make sense here. We've just got a couple jewel buildings that are really special that we want to keep. And a district doesn't really make sense because most of the rest of it's not so good. I remember writing a National Register nomination for a district, and there were some modern intrusions, and the decision at the time was exclude those. We didn't have the same idea those people did in those others where they wanted to make the big district to include more stuff to control it. The idea was really to pull it back. There are a couple, I'm trying to think of a specific example of a historic district I recommended against. There's probably one near Wrigley Field in Chicago I recommended against because it just didn't have integrity. But if it didn't have much integrity or sort of a unifying purpose, yeah, I could recommend against it.
In historic districts, can you totally have a business historic district and a residential historic, or do you combine both of those together?
That's a really good question. Most of the historic districts you saw in this example, and almost all the ones in the United States, tend to be residential. I can remember when there are some commercial ones. They're unusual. I used to have a slide in here, and I guess I left it out. They created one in Chicago in an old German neighborhood called the Armitage-Halstead district, and it was only commercial buildings in this 2 commercial streets that intersected. And it was really interesting because it'll take us back to the idea of who's for and against the historic district. So most of the building owners were against it. Most of the business owners were in favor of it because those 2 groups aren't identical. And it was created because the same way I as a homeowner want my house to preserve the value, they saw the attractiveness of the street as bringing the people into their store. So yes, you can have commercial, and you can have some that combine. But they you end up having different design guidelines because you get very different design guidelines for what to do with commercial storefronts than you do with houses.
I have just a comment. I was really happy to hear you say how good our guidelines are that we
Yes.
have published right now. I think a lot of people in town don't understand that our guidelines cover 96 specific structures that are scattered all around town. So we don't have one cohesive historic district here and one cohesive historic district there.
Right.
So our future going ahead needs to find ways to get more control of infill. What comes in, because right now you may have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 little historic houses in a cluster, a vacant lot that sells, and pretty soon you've got a 3-story house on it. So that's where, when we have our wrap-up, when we have it, are the kind of things I think we need to think about. Do we actually make one cohesive historic district on that side of the highway? Do we do one cohesive one on this side of the highway? We've tried before and we failed.
Yep.
So I think that's where our wrap-up needs to be when we start talking about what we're going to do going into the future.
Thank you.
There was one other question that I think that several people have asked. So what was the outcome of those dollar Frank Lloyd Wright buildings?
We delayed the development until the value changed. No, we probably still lost $30,000 on each house when we rehabbed them and sold them. But yeah, that's how depressed a value can be because of location. We tend to think of how high a value can go with location. It can also go way down.
And I think one fear we've talked about in a previous session, we talked about how do we keep the values from going up too high.
Right.
Luckily, it's a small concession, but Castroville does have an over 65 tax exemption. If you're over 65, you live in the city limits, file for that, please. We do save you money there. But my bigger fear would be that the property values go down.
Yeah.
If the property values are going down, you run into the same kind of situation where you could be completely negative, and the people that you want to hand that down to, like our home, we're not going to sell it. We'll hand it down to our kids, but we want to leave them with something of value. So a couple of things you mentioned, I really want to call out something that really resonated with me. One, I loved the quote, and I knew I couldn't do it justice, so thank you for doing that. And I'm sorry for being tempted to steal it, but I knew I wouldn't do it justice. But it's totally true. And this is something that we struggle with a lot. Yeah. This is opponents to historical districts have this, they're on one side and the proponents are on the other side. You said, look at the things that you have, look at your past to determine what elements of that you want to have in your future. Mm-hmm. And that really resonates with what Catherine said last week, and that is, I know where I am, and I'm here on purpose. I want to be here. And I think that that's what we're trying to find. And so for the rest of us, this is part of the journey that we're going through, is to determine what that looks like. We've already got really good guidelines in the historic building guidelines. Just a new development I want to let you know about. We've decided to extend this one more week. I apologize, but we have so much fun with you. We are going to have another gentleman next week. He'll talk about some really interesting topics. One of them is Highway 90. What can we do? Our first one had mentioned some items on that. Our last one will mention some items on that. He'll also talk about some other kind of unique things to reduce traffic, to create some additional economic opportunities, and some of the stuff that's more about the east side, the new development. So that's next week. The following week, we have to determine the date because we don't have it yet. But had this epiphany over the weekend that this whole process is about determining what we want as a community. So we want to make sure that we have it as a community. And I know that we've had some great speakers. Am I right? And I want everybody to have the opportunity to challenge. City Council has got some big decisions in front of them coming up, so I want you to have the opportunity free, so you don't have to worry about insulting them, because it's not about their content, it's about our implementation of them. So I want you to have that opportunity to do that. So we will announce that as far and wide as we can. We'll send that out. If you didn't leave your email address, please make sure that you leave your email address so that we can get in touch with you. And what we'll do is work with city staff on putting this together. Bryce has voluntold to come in and help us through that. We'll make some recommendations, and what the outcome of what we'll present to you is what our strategy is based on what we've heard and what we have heard from the community, what we believe is the right direction to go. So then you can look at what is important to you, what is not important to you, how do you feel about our implementation strategy, because it is really important that we follow this up with action. So we want to make sure that you have that opportunity. That is coming up. So that's all of this for now. I would just want to take one moment to thank everybody that's here. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you, Vince Michael. Sounds like a rock star, and he is. I want to thank our elected officials. We have council people. We have our county commissioner, Larry Sitter, who's been here throughout. He missed the first one, but he had an excuse, but he's been there to support this because this community is important to him as well. Claudia Mora from ACOG, thank you, and we miss having you around, but we're glad you're back. Oh, how can I forget? Keith Lutz, your county judge-elect, January 1st in that position, but always, he's provided the sound equipment. He's always there for us. He's been a great partner throughout. And Darren Ham, our Director of Tourism and Business Development, Scott Dixon from the city staff, Darren Schroeder, no. I'd like to thank Arnie, who's always taking care of everything for us and reminds me that somebody left a key last week. So if you left a key, we found it. Oh. We had Jen's, Walmart, Jukes, Magnolia. We have had the entire community out for this, so thank you. If we have missed anybody, please let them know. This is so crucial that we get as much feedback. We've had great participation through this. We've got a lot more people to reach. We want to make sure that everybody has a hand in their own future.